right, I'm Tony Pellegrino from GenRight Off-Road, and we're going to continue our next part on terminology, which is steering. We're going to talk about what makes up the steering, what the differences are between the steering, and explain all of the terms you've heard so that you can understand it and realize what you have and what you want. All right? So, stock steering. This is the typical Y-link style steering. And for the most part, it's pretty good. As you put a lift kit in, it requires you using a drop Pitman arm. You've probably heard that term before. So the Pitman arm is what connects the steering box down to the drag link and ultimately the tie rod. This particular one is an aftermarket version, which is slightly upgraded. We've got the stock version right here on the table. Maybe we can zoom out and show you what the stock version looks like. It is very thin. In fact, I'll give you an example. That's the size of my pinky. So, you know, you're not talking about very big components. And these tubes are hollow. So basically the moment that you touch this thing, it's just going to fold up. And this little steering stabilizer looks like something off my screen door out to the garage. So it's very lightweight and not going to do much. So this one here has an aftermarket steering stabilizer. That's necessary once you go with bigger tires, right? Because the bigger tires are going to start picking up more grooves in the road. And typically to put bigger tires on also means you have more offset on the wheels. So now everything is leveraged out, meaning that everything on the road wants to grab your vehicle, okay? So typical steering here, you can see that it's you know, about the same height as the axle tube, and it also uses what's called tie rod ends in all three spots. So that's a pretty normal steering. Okay. The next step when you talk about steering is this one here on the bottom. So this would be an upgraded style steering with heavier duty tie rod and drag link, also a much better aftermarket steering stabilizer. And you know, this is an upgrade from what we just looked at, but you can see that it's still very low, right? And low stuff, you can tell this one's already been hitting the rocks, tends to get scratched, bent, or broken. Then you go to a steering like what we offer, and this is what's called high steer. So now you can see the tie rod is moved way up above the center line of the axle, and the drag link is almost flat. So the flatter the drag link also means you don't get bump steer. So as the suspension goes down the road and you hit things, it has very little change in the attitude. And you can also see that the track bar, which is right here, hides behind the drag link in the exact same plane. This one does a pretty good job, except the length of the track bar goes from here to here, so that they're dramatically different than the drag link, where this one, they're perfectly matched, okay? So all of these little things make a big difference, okay? And I know, you know, we're just kind of covering the surface here, but I want to point these out. The other thing you'll notice in this top of the line steering is that it uses Heim rod ends. So these are an aircraft grade, you know, like race spec quality, kind of an ball end that allows a range of motion that, as this is cycling, has more range of motion than a standard tie rod end. So this is definitely an upgrade, and you can see, obviously, this has also got an upgraded axle and coilovers. So, you know, we kind of went from stock to somewhat upgraded to top of the line. And what you're looking at here is like our GenRight Elite or Tracer suspension. Okay? All right. Next, we just mentioned that, you know, this is a little closer picture. Tie rod end, you know, where it's just got one nut. They call this a castle nut with a cotter pin. That's pretty normal. And you can see that that's just, you know, this is stock or what most car steering setups look like, right? So also very common on four-wheel drives, but a little bit beefier version. Then you look at our version, where it goes to a double shear Heim rod end, and that is very, very strong versus single shear here. Okay, so we're always looking to increase the amount of surface or power we have to hold something. You know, this is using probably the equivalent of a 5/8 bolt. This is using a 3/4 inch bolt, and it's double shear. So, you know, the strength factor has gone up about 4 times on that setup. So if you're spending a lot of money on steering, you want to make sure that you're getting a nice quality. We use FK brand Heims. Those are top of the line. Again, aircraft grade. Okay, this is the next thing that is very, very misunderstood. Full hydraulic steering versus hydro assist, okay? So in this case, you still have a steering box, and this ram assists the steering box. So inside the steering box, which I happen to have one right here, this round section right here, there's a piston in here that drives the gears. This is what makes up the power assist, right? So there's a pump driven on the motor that is pressurizing the fluid, and this ram, this big piston inside here, helps to drive the gears, okay? And that makes it easy for you to steer. This inside here is 2.5 to 3 inch diameter, okay? Now, we're going to add a ram like this that's also about 1.75 to 2 inch diameter that will now assist the steering box. So you effectively have 3 to 4 inch volume of piston to drive your steering. This setup over here at the most is 2 5/16 in diameter, and that's all you get. So a lot of people think that this is more powerful, and it's not. This is actually the most powerful system, and it also allows you to have the feel of the road. This system here is completely feel free, right? You can't feel anything. If you jerk the wheel, sometimes, depending on the RPM of the motor, it'll steer a lot or it'll steer very little. The only reason somebody would do this is if they've stretched the front end so far forward that they can't fit the steering box anymore, or they're using the type of suspension that is longer travel than these pieces can have a range of motion, okay? So those are the only 2 reasons that you'd want to go to full hydro. This, what we call ram assist or hydro assist, is a much, much better way to go. And don't let anybody tell you any different. That's definitely the way to go. All right, let's talk scrub radius. So this is a very important aspect because it has to do with how your tire breaks traction when you turn the steering wheel. So this is stock, and you can see that the 2 points almost come together here. It's on a more narrow wheel, and you know, really you're not worried a ton about braking traction because you're not really in a high performance mode where you're worried about that. Where it gets worse is when you put on a bigger, wider tire and wheel, these 2 points get further apart. So what that means is that when you turn, that wheel is swinging a long way and dragging the tire on the ground or breaking traction. The way we do it is we push the wheel back over the knuckle and the bearings where these 2 points meet to make it ideal. And here you can see when you turn the wheel, you can see each little tread because it's not breaking the traction. This is super important when you're trying to stay on your line and you're also not fighting the steering wheel because everything's working on a perfect axis. All right, next subject, bump steer. You guys have probably heard this, and it's a function of the drag link not being the same length as the track bar, okay? Not to be confused with the tie rod, all right? So the tie rod is the lowest one. The track bar is this one that's just in the back with a slight bend to it, and then the drag link. So the drag link and the track bar have to be the same length, and they have to be in the same plane, and that is very important. Or when this suspension cycles up and down, so say you're going over a bridge, overpass, or a railroad track, or through a dip on the road, right now what'll happen is you got to chase the wheel to still stay going straight. When it's properly set up, you don't have to do that. You'll be able to just bounce through something or over something, and the vehicle will continue to go straight. So as you upgrade your suspension and you get to this upper level, what happens is you don't utilize any of the factory brackets. So when you use the factory brackets on your frame, there's only so much you can do, right? They were designed for a Jeep with 31-inch tires, right? Now you got 37s or 40-inch tires on here, which requires a completely different suspension on here, much more heavy duty, bigger axles. You've also added a ram assist, so you got a lot more power in the steering. Everything has to be beefier, including the brackets that hold all this to the frame. So these are very important aspects, and if you just keep bolting stuff on, what's going to happen is it's either going to rip the brackets off the axle or it's going to rip the brackets off the frame. So you really want to get yourself moved to where you're adding the heavier duty brackets, and that'll serve you well. And then in the process, if you're using GenRight components, they're going to be matched and built right so that you don't get bump steer, you don't get scrub radius. You're maximizing everything out of the suspension. Track bars. All right, track bars, also something that's terribly misunderstood. And there's a lot of aftermarket track bars, and typically if you've bought a aftermarket suspension, it came with a track bar. So this happens to be, we chose this one because it's easy to see, it's red, and it looks beefy, right? But it's got this like funky clamp system in here, with a hollow tube in the middle, which I don't really care for. And then you can see over here, it necks way down to something about the size of my finger. And then it's got a tiny little rubber joint in there. So using a factory bolt, right? So although it looks beefy, and quite honestly, that's how they sell it, it also is the same length as the factory one. It gives you some adjustment, but it's not enough, it's not right. You can see on the bottom, what we did was we cut off the factory bracket and we tilt it out so it matches the length of the tie rod. And then our track bar, it has very little bends in it opposed to this one. Every time you bend something, it creates a weak spot. So you want your track bar or your drag link, like anything in your steering, you want as straight as possible. These are super important aspects. And this is probably the best example I can give you about how to do this and why it's important. All of these little clamps, and these are hollow tubes, all that stuff is just, you hit it once and that stuff's just gonna fold up like an aluminum can, where these are heavy duty, thick wall tubes that are gonna last forever, quite frankly. So this is all stuff, and I wanted to make sure I took some of the mystery out of the whole track bar thing. It is an important piece. This holds your entire front end under your Jeep. So whether you're wheeling or you're winching or just steering down the road, this is what's keeping it underneath your Jeep. So very, very important piece. And if it gets any kind of slop or anything in it, this is what's gonna start causing you death wobble. All right? Let's see what else we got. Twisted Pitman arms. Okay. You want to keep going? Yeah? Keep going. All right. So, Pitman arm. This is what your stock one looks like, right? Pretty simple. Believe it or not, this is actually quite strong. It's forged steel, and but it is single shear. As you can see, it comes up, there's one nut on there, and that's all you get, right? We make one that is double shear. This is important, right? So the heim goes in, you get 2 shearing points, and this is it right here, bolted on to the steering box. And you can also see that this, if I set this flat, how it's twisted down. We do that because you have more down travel than you do up travel. So what that does is it puts the Heim in a neutral position where it can use the entire range of motion of the ball. So that's a very important aspect to make sure that you don't get any bind in the steering system. You can see this one, it's already cranked over at almost its max, just sitting there at ride height, but this hasn't even been articulated or anything. So this is where you cause damage. A lot of the time you can either damage this, or you can break the sector shaft, or somehow damage the steering box, or break one of these rods. And I've seen many people stuck out on the trail because of this kind of a situation. So you definitely want to make sure that you don't have this, and you're looking at these components carefully each time you get off the trail. All right, that's the end of this episode. Stay tuned for more stages of the terminology video series. We're covering all kinds of subject, and it'll tell you everything you need to know to become an expert in terminology about your Jeep.